On the deadly slopes of Mount Everest, there's one climber who disappeared without a trace, never to be seen again. This is the most mysterious disappearance in Everest's history. Our story starts in Chamonix, France, a small town known for its snowy mountains and freezing winds. Marco Siffredi was born there on May 22, 1979. Growing up surrounded by mountains, Marco's family were expert skiers and mountain guides, but he knew the dangers of living so close to Europe's tallest peaks. When Marco was just a baby, he lost his older brother Pierre to an avalanche, a loss that haunted him for the rest of his life. Even though skiing was in his family's legacy, Marco was drawn to snowboarding. In 1995, he switched to snowboarding and loved the freedom it gave him. Within a year, he mastered the sport and began pushing his limits. Surrounded by snow-covered mountains, the thrill of the extreme was too much to resist. In 1996, he successfully snowboarded down the Mallory route, a difficult path on the north face of the Aiguille du Midi. This mountain, which rises to 12,400 feet, is a popular spot for tourists. Most people take a lift to the top to admire the breathtaking views of the Alps, with Mont Blanc in the distance. But the brave ones like Marco chose the dangerous Mallory route down the steep mountain face. Skiers and snowboarders on this route face over 3,600 feet of no-fall skiing, meaning if you fall, you die. The route was famous for being one of the most dangerous in the world, but Marco didn't want to be like everyone else. He didn't want to just be another extreme skier. He wanted to do something no one else had done before, to be a pioneer. He was determined to be the greatest, even if it meant pushing himself beyond his limits. By 22, Marco had already achieved great things. He was the first to snowboard down the north face of the Aiguille Verte and the Aiguille du Midi. But Europe's tallest mountains weren't enough for Marco. He wanted more, so in 1999, he went to Nepal. There, he climbed and snowboarded down Dorje Lakpa, a mountain nearly 23,000 feet tall. As he descended, Marco stopped to look at the amazing view. In the distance, he saw Mount Everest towering over the other mountains. That's when a terrifying idea struck him. He decided to snowboard down Everest, the tallest mountain on Earth. But Marco knew this wasn't something to take lightly. Everest was dangerous, and he needed to be fully prepared. Marco turned to Russell Bryce, a climber who had led 17 expeditions to the top of Everest. Russell would help Marco get ready for this deadly challenge ahead. To prepare for the biggest climb of his life and the dangerous descent, Marco practiced on some of the highest mountains in the world, like Cho Oyu in Nepal and Huayna Potosi in South America. He was getting used to extreme heights and pushing his limits even more on steep slopes like the north face of the Aiguille Verte. Though he had mastered many tough descents, he hadn't ridden at such high altitudes before. This added even more danger to his already risky plan. After training in high altitudes and conquering more mountains, Marco headed to Nepal. He hired Sherpas to help with his equipment and began the long 2-month process of getting used to the conditions at base camp. With his preparations finished, Marco was ready for the challenge. But then something unexpected happened. A man named Dr. Stefan Gatt from Austria was also trying to be the first to snowboard down Everest. Stefan had already started a day or two before Marco, but Marco didn't give up. On May 23, 2001, just one day after his 22nd birthday, he reached the top of Mount Everest. Most people can only stay at the summit for 15 minutes because of the freezing cold and lack of oxygen. But Marco stayed for almost an hour, resting and getting ready for the real challenge ahead. Stefan had already begun his descent, but he didn't snowboard the whole way down. He had to climb part of the way too. Marco just needed to make it back to base camp without getting off his snowboard, and the record would be his. But things took a turn. Marco had planned to descend via the Hornbeam Couloir, a dangerous route, but it had been stripped of snow by the wind. It was now bare rock. Marco decided to take a different route, the Norton Couloir. Just as he was preparing for this, disaster struck. His snowboard binding snapped in the freezing cold, putting everything in danger. It seemed like a warning, like the mountain didn't want him to go on. But one of the Sherpas managed to fix the binding with some wire, and Marco was able to keep going. He sped down the mountain, passing other climbers who couldn't believe their eyes. He skillfully avoided rocks and steep slopes and made it to the North Col, where he rested for an hour. The rest of the descent went perfectly. Marco reached the advanced base camp in under 4 hours, setting the record for the longest continuous snowboard descent in history. He became the first person ever to snowboard all the way down the highest mountain in the world. But Marco wasn't done. He wanted to snowboard down Everest again, this time via the Hornbein Couloir. His friends and family were terrified and begged him not to do it. They feared for his life, but Marco shrugged off their worries. "If we don't do crazy things at 20, we won't do anything at 50, he said. This time, he raised 45,000 euros of his own money to fund the adventure. On Thursday, August 8, 2002, Marco left Chamonix and headed for Nepal. But this time, he left something behind. His lucky cross, the one thing he always carried on his expeditions. Was this a bad sign? When he got to Kathmandu, he checked into the Hotel Tibet and contacted the 3 Sherpas who would go with him: Furba, Panaro, and Datenzing. 2 days later, on August 10th, they reached Everest's advanced base camp. Marco looked around and was shocked. The landscape was completely different from the year before. A thick blanket of snow covered everything, and there was no one else in sight. What had once been a busy, crowded place full of excited climbers was now completely deserted. For the next 2 weeks, Marco and his Sherpas prepared for the climb, spending time getting used to the altitude and carrying supplies up the mountain. But the area where Marco planned to snowboard was dangerous, riddled with avalanches. Heavy snow covered the steep slopes, ready to fall at any moment. Traveling from the advanced base camp to Camp 1 and then Camp 2 was slow and exhausting. The snow was so deep, it reached their waists. This is why climbers usually avoid Everest in the summer. It's monsoon season, and the heavy rain falls as snow at these heights. But there's another danger too: storms. The weather on Everest can change in seconds, and summer storms can stop anyone from reaching the top. Marco relied on his weather expert, Jan Gondaner, back in Chamonix to keep an eye on the conditions. They stayed in touch through a satellite phone. Over the next few weeks, Marco had to turn back several times because of storms, heavy snow, or dangerous conditions. But soon, Jan said the weather would be clear for a few days. The forecast predicted clear skies for Saturday, September 8, 2002. Marco decided that would be the day he would try to summit. But the Sherpas begged him to wait. Another Sherpa was bringing a better radio, so Marco could stay in touch with them and base camp while coming back down. But the Sherpa with the radio was still a day or 2 away, and Marco didn't want to miss the chance for clear weather. So, against his Sherpas' advice, he set off for the summit. When he reached Camp 2, he told his parents he was still at base camp, not wanting to worry them. On Saturday, September 7th, Marco and the Sherpas left Camp 3 at 1:30 a.m., hoping to reach the top that day. But the climb was slow, and the deep snow made it harder to move. The team was in the death zone, above 26,000 feet, where the air is so thin it's hard for the body to survive. 12.5 hours later, at 2:10 p.m., they finally reached the summit of Everest. They had made it. For most people, reaching the top is a moment of joy and excitement. But for Marco, the hard part had just begun. The real challenge was still ahead. Looking down, Marco saw dark clouds gathering quickly. The Sherpas warned him about the bad weather and urged him to rethink his plan. But Marco was determined. This adventure had taken over a year to plan and had cost him 45,000 euros. While Sherpa Furba helped Marco pack his backpack with a fresh oxygen tank, climbing gear, and water, another Sherpa took a photo of them. It turned out to be the last photo of Marco. In the picture, Marco is standing at the edge of a steep drop, strapped into his snowboard, wearing a yellow jumpsuit, hat, goggles, and gloves. It's an amazing shot, taken high above the clouds. At 3 p.m., later than he should have, Marco slid down the peak and started carving through the fresh snow. After a few yards, he stopped to catch his breath and wait for the Sherpas to catch up. They were following the rope they had laid out, but when they reached Marco to say goodbye, he was already breathing heavily. The 12-hour climb had drained him, and now, carrying a backpack at 29,000 feet while making sharp turns on the steep slopes was taking all his strength. A moment later, Marco let go of the rope and snowboarded away from the Sherpas, heading toward the Hornbein couloir. The mountain was covered in thick, swirling clouds, and by 3:15 p.m., the Sherpas watched in silence as Marco's tiny figure disappeared into the mist. Marco was facing the most dangerous challenge of his life. He thought he could make it because he had done it before, but one wrong move, one mistake, and it could all be over for the 23-year-old. The Sherpas quickly headed down the mountain, trying to move fast. They had already spent too much time so high up, and with the storm coming, they needed to get to safety before nightfall. But then, something strange and terrifying happened. As the Sherpas were packing up at Camp 3, they looked down the mountain, nearly 4,000 feet below them, and saw a figure standing on the North Kernel. It was strange because they knew they were the only ones on the mountain. The figure was perched on the mountainside. Then it stood up and slid silently down. The Sherpas couldn't speak. They were frozen with fear. What had they just seen? They hurried to pack up and rushed toward the North Kernel. When they reached the spot where they had seen the figure, there were no tracks, no signs of anyone. That's when the terrible truth hit them. It was an apparition, and Marco was no longer alive. When Marco didn't return to base camp, their worst fears came true. A search and rescue mission was launched, but the stormy weather and dangerous conditions made it nearly impossible. Even with helicopters and rescue dogs, they found no trace of Marco. There are many guesses about what happened to Marco, but no one knows for sure. One idea is that Marco might have triggered an avalanche while crossing the mountain, which could have swept him away and buried him. Another theory is that he lost his balance and fell into a bergschrund, a deep crack in the ice that can be more than 300 feet deep. If the fall didn't kill him, being trapped deep inside would have. The most comforting idea comes from Marco's sister, Chloe. She believes Marco made the descent but chose to stay in Tibet, living among the mountains and always chasing the highest peaks and the greatest adventures. But despite all the guesses, Marco's body was never found, and what really happened to him remains a mystery. A month later, a memorial was held for Marco at Everest Base Camp. His family, girlfriend, closest friends, and the Sherpas who had helped him were all there. Marco's incredible achievements at such high altitudes made him respected among the world's toughest skiers and snowboarders. He achieved more than most people do in a lifetime, but for Marco, it was never enough.